Charlie and the Chocolate Factory by Roald Dahl. There are two very old people in this story. They are the father and mother of Mr. Bucket. Their names are Grandpa Joe and Grandma Josephine. There are also two other very old people in this story. They are the father and mother of Mrs. Bucket. Their names are Grandpa George and Grandma Georgina. Then there is Mr. Bucket and Mrs. Bucket. Mr. and Mrs. Bucket have a small boy whose name is Charlie Bucket. And this is Charlie. How'd you do? And how'd you do? And how'd you do again? He is pleased to meet you. The whole of this family, the 6 grown-ups and little Charlie Bucket, lived together in a small wooden house on the edge of a great town. The house wasn't nearly large enough for so many people, and life was extremely uncomfortable for them all. There were only 2 rooms in the place altogether, and there was only 1 bed. The bed was given to the 4 old grandparents because they were so old and tired. They were so tired, they never got out of it. Grandpa Joe and Grandma Josephine on this side, Grandpa George and Grandma Georgina on this side. Mr. and Mrs. Bucket and little Charlie Bucket slept in the other room, upon mattresses on the floor. In the summertime this wasn't too bad, but in the winter freezing cold drafts blew across the floor all night long, and it was awful. There wasn't any question of them being able to buy a better house, or even 1 more bed to sleep in. They were far too poor for that. Mr. Bucket was the only person in the family with a job. He worked in a toothpaste factory where he sat all day long at a bench and screwed the little caps onto the tops of the tubes of toothpaste after the tubes had been filled. But a toothpaste cap screwer is never paid very much money. And poor Mr. Bucket, however hard he worked and however fast he screwed on the caps, was never able to make enough to buy 1/2 of the things that so large a family needed. There wasn't even enough money to buy proper food for them all. The only meals they could afford were bread and margarine for breakfast, boiled potatoes and cabbage for lunch, and cabbage soup for supper. Sundays were a bit better. They all looked forward to Sundays because then, although they had exactly the same, everyone was allowed a second helping. The Buckets, of course, didn't starve, but every one of them, the 2 old grandfathers, the 2 old grandmothers, Charlie's father, Charlie's mother, and especially little Charlie himself, went about from morning till night with a horrible, empty feeling in their tummies. Charlie felt it worst of all, and although his father and mother often went without their own share of lunch or supper so that they could give it to him, it still wasn't nearly enough for a growing boy. He desperately wanted something more filling. The only thing he longed for, more than anything else, was chocolate. Walking to school in the mornings, Charlie could see great slabs of chocolate piled up high in the shop windows, and he would stop and stare and press his nose against the glass, his mouth watering like mad. Many times a day he would see other children taking bars of creamy chocolate out of their pockets and munching them greedily, and that, of course, was pure torture. Only once a year, on his birthday, did Charlie Bucket ever get to taste a bit of chocolate. The whole family saved up their money for that special occasion, and when the great day arrived, Charlie was always presented with 1 small chocolate bar to eat all by himself. And each time he received it, on those marvelous birthday mornings, he would place it carefully in a small wooden box that he owned and treasure it as though it were a bar of solid gold. And for the next few days, he would allow himself only to look at it, but never to touch it. And then at last, when he could stand it no longer, he would peel back a tiny bit of the paper wrapping at one corner to expose a tiny bit of chocolate, and then he would take a tiny nibble, just enough to allow the lovely sweet taste to spread out slowly over his tongue. The next day, he would take another tiny nibble, and so on and so on, and in this way, Charlie would make his 6-penny bar of birthday chocolate last him for more than a month. But I haven't yet told you about the one awful thing that tortured little Charlie, the lover of chocolate, more than anything else. This thing for him was far, far worse than seeing slabs of chocolate in front of him. It was the most terrible, torturing thing you could imagine, and it was this. In the town itself, actually within sight of the house in which Charlie lived, there was an enormous chocolate factory. Just imagine that. And it wasn't simply an ordinary enormous chocolate factory either. It was the largest and most famous in the whole world. It was Wonka's factory, owned by a man called Mr. Willy Wonka, the greatest inventor and maker of chocolates that there has ever been. And what a tremendous, marvelous place it was. It had huge iron gates leading into it, and a high wall surrounding it, and smoke belching from its chimneys, and strange whizzing sounds coming from deep inside it. And outside the walls, for half a mile around in every direction, the air was scented with the heavy, rich smell of melting chocolate. Twice a day, on his way to and from school, little Charlie Bucket had to walk right past the gates of the factory. And every time he went by, he would begin to walk very, very slowly. And he would hold his nose high in the air and take long, deep sniffs of the gorgeous chocolatey smell all around him. Oh, how he loved that smell. And oh, how he wished he could go inside the factory and see what it was like. In the evenings, after he had finished his supper of watery cabbage soup, Charlie always went into the room of his 4 grandparents to listen to their stories, and then afterwards to say good night. Every one of these old people was over 90. They were as shriveled as prunes, and throughout the day they lay huddled in their one bed, 2 at either end, with nightcaps on to keep their heads warm, dozing the time away with nothing to do. But as soon as they heard the door opening, and heard Charlie's voice saying, "Good evening, Grandpa Joe and Grandma Josephine, and Grandpa George and Grandma Georgina," then all 4 of them would suddenly sit up, and their old wrinkled faces would light up with smiles of pleasure, and the talking would begin. For they loved this little boy. He was the only bright thing in their lives. Often, Charlie's mother and father would come in as well, and stand by the door, listening to the stories that the old people told. And thus, for perhaps half an hour every night, this room would become a happy place. One evening, when Charlie went in to see his grandparents, he said to them, "Is it really true that Wonka's chocolate factory is the biggest in the world?" "True!" cried all 4 of them at once. "Of course it's true. It's about 50 times as big as any other." "And is Mr. Willy Wonka really the cleverest chocolate maker in the world?" "My dear boy," said Grandpa Joe, raising himself up a little higher on his pillow, "Mr. Willy Wonka is the most amazing, the most fantastic, the most extraordinary chocolate maker the world has ever seen. He's a magician with chocolate. He can make anything, anything he wants. Isn't that a fact, my dears?" The other 3 old people nodded their heads, and Grandpa Joe said, "You mean to say I've never told you about Mr. Willy Wonka and his factory?" "Never," answered little Charlie. "Good heavens above! Will you tell me now, Grandpa Joe, please?" "I certainly will. Sit down beside me on the bed." Grandpa Joe was the oldest of the 4 grandparents. He was 96 and a half, and that is just about as old as anybody can be. Like all extremely old people, he was delicate and weak, and throughout the day he spoke very little. But in the evenings, when Charlie, his beloved grandson, was in the room, he seemed in some marvelous way to grow quite young again. All his tiredness fell away from him, and he became as eager and excited as a young boy. "Oh, what a man he is, this Mr. Willy Wonka," cried Grandpa Joe. "Did you know, for example, that he has himself invented more than 200 new kinds of chocolate bars, each with a different center, each far sweeter and creamier and more delicious than anything any other chocolate factories can make?" "Perfectly true," cried Grandma Josephine. "And he sends them to all the 4 corners of the earth. Isn't that so, Grandpa Joe?" "It is, my dear, but it isn't only chocolate bars that he makes. Oh, dear me, no. He has some really fantastic inventions up his sleeve, Mr. Willy Wonka has. Did you know that he's invented a way of making chocolate ice cream so that it stays cold for hours and hours without being in the refrigerator? You can even leave it lying in the sun all morning on a hot day and it won't go runny." "But that's impossible," said little Charlie, staring at his grandfather. "Of course it's impossible," cried Grandpa Joe, "but Mr. Willy Wonka has done it. "Quite right," the others agreed, nodding their heads. "Mr. Wonka has done it." "And then again," Grandpa Joe went on, speaking very slowly now, "Mr. Willy Wonka can make marshmallows that taste of violets, and rich caramels that can change color every 10 seconds as you suck them. He can make chewing gum that never loses its taste, and sugar balloons that you can blow up to enormous sizes before you pop them with a pin and gobble them up." While they were talking, Mr. and Mrs. Bucket, Charlie's mother and father, had come quietly into the room, and now both were standing just inside the door, listening. "Tell Charlie about that crazy Indian prince," said Grandma Josephine. "He'd like to hear that." "You mean Prince Pondicherry?" said Grandpa Joe, and he began chuckling with laughter. "What did he do?" asked Charlie eagerly. "Listen, and I'll tell you," said Grandpa Joe. "Prince Pondicherry wrote a letter to Mr. Willy Wonka and asked him to come all the way out to India to build him a colossal palace entirely out of chocolate. And what a palace it was! It had 100 rooms, and everything was made either of dark or light chocolate. The bricks were chocolate, and the cement holding them together was chocolate, and the windows were chocolate, and all the walls and ceilings were made of chocolate, and when you turned on the taps in the bathroom, hot chocolate came pouring out. When it was all finished, Mr. Wonka said to Prince Pondicherry, 'I warn you, though, it won't last very long, so you'd better start eating it right away.' 'Nonsense,' shouted the prince. 'I'm not going to eat my palace. I'm not even going to nibble the staircase or lick the walls. I'm going to live in it.' But Mr. Wonka was right, of course, because soon after this there came a very hot day with a boiling sun, and the whole palace began to melt. And then it sank slowly to the ground, and the crazy prince, who was dozing in the living room at the time, woke up to find himself swimming around in a huge brown sticky lake of chocolate. Little Charlie sat very still on the edge of the bed, staring at his grandfather. "Is all this really true?" he asked. "Or are you pulling my leg?" "It's true," cried all four of the old people at once. "Of course it's true." And now he leaned closer to Charlie and lowered his voice to a soft, secret whisper. "Nobody ever comes out." "Out of where?" asked Charlie. "And nobody ever goes in." "In where?" cried Charlie. "Wonka's factory, of course." "Grandpa, what do you mean?" "I mean workers, Charlie." "Workers?" "All factories," said Grandpa Joe, "have workers streaming in and out of the gates in the mornings and evenings, except Wonka's. Have you ever seen a single person going into that place, or coming out?" Little Charlie looked slowly around at each of the four old faces, one after the other, and they all looked back at him. They were friendly, smiling faces, but they were also quite serious. There was no sign of joking or leg-pulling on any of them. "Well, have you?" asked Grandpa Joe. I really don't know, Grandpa," Charlie stammered. "Whenever I walk past the factory, the gates seem to be closed." "Exactly," said Grandpa Joe. "But there must be people working there." "Not people, Charlie. Not ordinary people, anyway." "Then who?" cried Charlie. "Aha, that's it. You see, that's another of Mr. Willy Wonka's clevernesses." "Charlie, dear," Mrs. Bucket called out from where she was standing by the door, "it's time for bed. That's enough for tonight." "But, Mother, I must hear—" "Tomorrow, my darling." The next evening, Grandpa Joe went on with his story. "You see, Charlie, not so very long ago, there used to be thousands of people working in Mr. Willy Wonka's factory. Then one day, all of a sudden, Mr. Wonka had to ask every single one of them to leave, to go home, never to come back." "But why?" asked Charlie. "Because of spies." "Spies?" "Yes. All the other chocolate makers, you see, had begun to grow jealous of the wonderful sweets that Mr. Wonka was making, and they started sending in spies to steal his secret recipes. The spies took jobs in the Wonka factory, pretending that they were ordinary workers, and while they were there, each one of them found out exactly how a certain special thing was made." "And did they go back to their own factories and tell?" asked Charlie. They must have, because soon after that, Fickelbruber's factory started making an ice cream that would never melt, even in the hottest sun. Then Mr. Prodnose's factory came out with a chewing gum that never lost its flavor, however much he chewed it. And then Mr. Slugworth's factory began making sugar balloons that you could blow up to huge sizes before you popped them with a pin and gobbled them up, and so on and so on. And Mr. Willy Wonka tore his beard and shouted, "This is terrible! I shall be ruined. I shall have to close the factory." "But he didn't do that," Charlie said. "Oh, yes, he did. He told all the workers that he was sorry, but they would have to go home. Then he shut the main gates and fastened them with a chain. And suddenly, Wonka's giant chocolate factory became silent and deserted. Months and months went by," Grandpa Joe went on, "but still the factory remained closed. And everybody said, 'Poor Mr. Wonka, he was so nice, and he made such marvelous things, but he's finished now. It's all over.' Then something astonishing happened. One day, early in the morning, thin columns of white smoke were seen to be coming out of the tops of the tall chimneys of the factory. People in the town stopped and stared. 'What's going on?' they cried. 'Someone's lit the furnaces. Mr. Wonka must be opening up again.' They ran to the gates, expecting to see them wide open. But no, the great iron gates were still locked and chained as securely as ever, and Mr. Wonka was nowhere to be seen. 'But the factory's working,' the people shouted. 'Listen, you can hear the machines, and you can smell the smell of melting chocolate in the air.' Grandpa Joe leaned forward. But most mysterious of all, Charlie, were the shadows in the windows of the factory. 'The place is full of workers,' the people shouted, 'but nobody's gone in. It's crazy.' But there was no question at all that the factory was running. And it's gone on running ever since for these last 10 years. What's more, the chocolates and sweets it's been turning out have become more fantastic and delicious all the time." "But Grandpa, who?" cried Charlie. "Who was Mr. Wonka using to do all the work in the factory?" "Nobody knows, Charlie." "But that's absurd. Hasn't someone asked Mr. Wonka?" "No one sees him anymore." "But Grandpa, what sort of people are they that work in there?" "My dear boy," said Grandpa Joe, "that is one of the great mysteries of the chocolate-making world. We only know one thing about them. They are very small, people no taller than my knee." "There aren't any such people," Charlie said. Just then, Mr. Bucket, Charlie's father, came into the room. He was home from the toothpaste factory, and he was waving an evening newspaper rather excitedly. "Have you heard the news?" he cried. He held up the paper so that they could see the huge headline. The headline said, "Wonka Factory to be opened at last to lucky few." "You mean people are actually going to be allowed to go inside the factory?" cried Grandpa Joe. "Read us what it says, quickly." "All right," said Mr. Bucket, smoothing up the newspaper. "Listen. Evening Bulletin. Mr. Willy Wonka, the confectionery genius whom nobody has seen for the last 10 years, sent out the following notice today. I, Willy Wonka, have decided to allow 5 children, just 5, mind you, and no more, to visit my factory this year. These lucky 5 will be shown around personally by me, and they will be allowed to see all the secrets and the magic of my factory. Then, at the end of the tour, as a special present, all of them will be given enough chocolates and sweets to last them for the rest of their lives. So watch out for the golden tickets. 5 golden tickets have been printed on golden paper, and these 5 golden tickets have been hidden underneath the ordinary wrapping paper of 5 ordinary bars of chocolate. These 5 chocolate bars may be anywhere, in any shop, in any street, in any town, in any country in the world, upon any counter where Wonka sweets are sold. And the 5 lucky finders of these 5 golden tickets are the only ones who will be allowed to visit my factory and see what it's like now inside. Good luck to you all, and happy hunting, signed, Willy Wonka." "That man's dirty," muttered Grandma Josephine. "He's brilliant," cried Grandpa Joe. He's a magician. Just imagine what will happen now. The whole world will be searching for those golden tickets. Everyone will be buying Wonka's chocolate bars in the hope of finding one. He'll sell more than ever before. Oh, wouldn't it be something, Charlie, to open a bar of chocolate and see a golden ticket glistening inside? It certainly would, Grandpa, but there isn't a hope, Charlie said sadly. I only get one bar a year. You never know, darling, said Grandma Georgina. It's your birthday next week. You have as much chance as anyone else. The very next day, the first golden ticket was found. The finder was a boy called Augustus Gloop, and Mr. Bucket's evening newspaper carried a large picture of him on the front page. The picture showed a 9-year-old boy who was so enormously fat he looked as though he'd been blown up with a powerful pump. The town in which Augustus Gloop lived, the newspaper said, had gone wild with excitement over their hero. I just knew Augustus would find a golden ticket, his mother had told the newspapermen. He eats so many bars of chocolate a day that it was almost impossible for him not to find one. What a thrill it will be for him to visit Mr. Wonka's marvelous factory. We're just as proud as anything. What a revolting woman, said Grandma Josephine. And what a repulsive boy, said Grandma Georgina. And now the whole country, indeed the whole world, seemed suddenly to be caught up in a mad chocolate-buying spree, everybody searching frantically for those precious remaining tickets. Fully grown women were seen going into sweet shops and buying 10 Wonka bars at a time, then tearing off the wrappers on the spot and peering eagerly underneath for a glint of golden paper. Children were taking hammers and smashing their piggy banks and running out to the shops with handfuls of money. In one city, a famous gangster robbed a bank of £1,000 and spent the whole lot on Wonka bars that same afternoon. And when the police entered the house to arrest him, they found him sitting on the floor amidst mountains of chocolate, ripping off the wrappers with the blade of a long dagger. Suddenly, on the day before Charlie Bucket's birthday, the newspapers announced that the second golden ticket had been found. The lucky person was a small girl called Veruca Salt, who lived with her rich parents in a great city far away. Once again, Mr. Bucket's evening newspaper carried a big picture of the finder. Veruca's father, Mr. Salt, had eagerly explained to the newspapermen exactly how the ticket was found. You see, boys, he had said, as soon as my little girl told me that she simply had to have one of those golden tickets, I went out into the town and I started buying up all the Wonka bars I could lay my hands on. Thousands of them I must have bought, hundreds of thousands. Then I had them loaded onto trucks and sent directly to my own factory. I'm in the peanut business, you see, and I got about 100 women working for me over my place, shelling peanuts for roasting and salting. That's what they do all day long, these women. They sit there shelling peanuts. So I says to them, okay, girls, I says, from now on you can stop shelling peanuts and start shelling the wrappers off these chocolate bars instead. And they did. I had every worker in the place yanking the paper off those bars of chocolate full speed ahead from morning till night. But 3 days went by and we had no luck. Oh, it was terrible. My little Veruca got more and more upset each day, and every time I went home she would scream at me, "Where's my golden ticket? I want my golden ticket." Well, I just hated to see my little girl feeling unhappy. Then suddenly, on the evening of the 4th day, one of my women workers yelled, "I've got it, a golden ticket." And I said, "Give it to me quick." And she did. And I rushed it home and gave it to my darling Veruca. And now she's all smiles and we have a happy home once again. That's even worse than the fat boy, said Grandma Josephine. She needs a really good spanking, said Grandma Georgina. Come to bed, my darling, said Charlie's mother. Tomorrow's your birthday, don't forget that. So I expect you'll be up early to open your present. A Wonka chocolate bar. It is a Wonka chocolate bar, isn't it? Yes, my love, his mother said. Of course it is. Happy birthday, cried the 4 old grandparents as Charlie came into their room early next morning. Charlie smiled nervously and sat down on the edge of the bed. He was holding his present, his only present, very carefully in his 2 hands. Wonka's Whipple Scrumptious Fudge Mallow Delight, it said on the wrapper. Mr. and Mrs. Bucket came in and stood at the front of the bed, watching Charlie. The room became silent. Everybody was waiting now for Charlie to start opening his present. Then Mrs. Bucket said gently, "You mustn't be too disappointed, my darling, if you don't find what you're looking for underneath that wrapper. You really can't expect to be as lucky as all that." Charlie didn't say anything. "After all," Grandma Josephine said, "in the whole wide world, there are only 3 tickets left to be found." "Just forget all about those golden tickets and enjoy the chocolate," Grandpa Joe said. "Why don't you do that?" They all knew it was ridiculous to expect this one poor little bar of chocolate to have a magic ticket inside it. And they were trying as gently and as kindly as they could to prepare Charlie for the disappointment. But there was one thing that the grown-ups also knew, and it was this, that however small the chance might be of striking lucky, the chance was there. The chance had to be there. This particular bar of chocolate had as much chance as any other of having a golden ticket. And that was why all the grandparents and parents in the room were actually just as tense and excited as Charlie was, although they were pretending to be very calm. "Open it, my dear," Grandma Georgina said. "Please open it, you're making me jumpy." Very slowly, Charlie's fingers began to tear open one small corner of the wrapping paper. The old people in the bed all leaned forward, craning their scraggy necks. And suddenly, as though he couldn't bear the suspense any longer, Charlie tore the wrapper right down the middle, and onto his lap there fell a light brown, creamy-colored bar of chocolate. There was no sign of a golden ticket anywhere. "Well, that's that," said Grandpa Joe brightly. "It's just what we expected." Charlie looked up. 4 kind old faces were watching him intently from the bed. He smiled at them, small, sad smile, and then he shrugged his shoulders and picked up the chocolate bar and held it out to his mother and said, "Here, Mother, have a bit. We'll share it. I want everybody to taste it." "Certainly not," his mother said. And all the others cried, "No, no, we wouldn't dream of it. It's all yours." "Please," begged Charlie, turning round and offering it to Grandpa Joe. But neither he nor anyone else would even take a tiny bit. "It's time to go to school, my darling," Mrs. Bucket said. "Come on, or you'll be late." That evening, Mr. Bucket's newspaper announced the finding of not only the 3rd golden ticket, but the 4th as well. "2 golden tickets found today," screamed the headlines. "Only 1 more left." "All right," said Grandpa Joe, when the whole family was gathered in the old people's room after supper. "Let's hear who found them." "The 3rd ticket," read Mr. Bucket, holding the newspaper up close to his face because his eyes were bad and he couldn't afford glasses. "The 3rd ticket was found by a Miss Violet Beauregard." There was great excitement in the Beauregard household when our reporter arrived to interview the lucky young lady. Cameras were clicking and flashbulbs were flashing, and the famous girl was standing on a chair in the living room, waving the golden ticket madly. She was talking very fast and very loudly to everyone, but it was not easy to hear all she said because she was chewing so ferociously on a piece of gum. "I'm a gum chewer normally," she shouted, "but when I heard about these ticket things of Mr. Wonka's, I gave up gum and started on chocolate bars in the hope of striking lucky. Now, of course, I'm back on gum. I just adore gum. My mother said it's not ladylike and it looks ugly to see a girl's jaws going up and down like mine do all the time, but I don't agree. And who's she to criticize anyway, because if you asked me, I'd say her jaws are going up and down almost as much as mine are, just from yelling at me every minute of the day." "Now, Violet," Mrs. Beauregard said from the far corner of the room where she was standing on the piano to avoid being trampled by the mob. "All right, Mother, keep your hair on," Miss Beauregard shouted. "And now," she went on, turning to the reporters again, "it may interest you to know that this piece of gum I'm chewing right now at this moment is one I've been working on for over 3 months solid. That's a record, that is. It's beaten the record held by my best friend, Miss Cornelia Princemetal, and she was furious. At night time, I just stick it on the end of the bedpost, and it's as good as ever in the mornings. A bit hard at first, maybe, but it soon softens up again after I'd given it a few good chews. Before I started chewing for the world record, I used to change my piece of gum once a day. I used to do it in our lift on the way home from school. Why, tried a lift because I liked sticking the gooey piece that I'd just finished with onto one of the control buttons. Then the next person who came along and pressed the button got my old gum on the end of his or her finger. Oh yes, I'm thrilled to be going to Mr. Walker's factory, and I understand that afterwards he's going to give me enough gum to last me for the rest of my whole life. Whoopee, hooray! Pish, silly girl, said Grandma Josephine. And who's got the fourth golden ticket? Charlie asked. Now, let me see, said Mr. Bucket, peering at the newspaper again. Ah, yes, here we are. The fourth golden ticket was found by a boy called Mike TV. Another bad lot, I'll be bound, muttered Grandma Josephine. The TV household, said Mr. Bucket, was crammed like all the others with excited visitors when our reporter arrived. But young Mike TV, the lucky winner, seemed extremely annoyed by the whole business. "Can't you fools see I'm watching television?" he said angrily. "I wish you wouldn't interrupt." The 9-year-old boy was seated before an enormous television set, with his eyes glued to the screen, and he was watching a film in which one bunch of gangsters was shooting up another bunch of gangsters with machine guns. Mike TV himself had no less than 18 toy pistols of various sizes hanging from belts around his body, and every now and again he would leap up into the air and fire off half a dozen rounds from one or another of these weapons. "Quiet," he shouted, when someone tried to ask him a question. "Didn't I tell you not to interrupt? This show's an absolute whiz-banger. They're terrific, these gangsters, especially when they start pumping each other full of lead. Gosh, what wouldn't I give to be doing that myself? It's the life, I tell you. It's terrific." "That's quite enough," snapped Grandma Josephine. "I can't bear to listen to it." "Nor me," said Grandma Georgina. "Do all children behave like this nowadays?" "Of course not," said Mrs. Bucket, smiling at the old lady in the bed. "Some do, of course. In fact, quite a lot of them do, but not all." "And now there's only one ticket left," said Grandpa George. "Quite so," sniffed Grandma Georgina. "And just as sure as I'll be having cabbage soup for supper tomorrow, that ticket will go to some nasty little beast who doesn't deserve it." The next day, when Charlie came home from school and went in to see his grandparents, he found that only Grandpa Joe was awake. The other three were all snoring loudly. "Shh," whispered Grandpa Joe, and he beckoned Charlie to come closer. Charlie tiptoed over and stood by the bed. The old man gave Charlie a sly grin, and then he started rummaging under his pillow with one hand. And when the hand came out again, there was an ancient leather purse clutched in the fingers. Under the cover of the bedclothes, the old man opened the purse and tipped it upside down. Out fell a single silver sixpence. "It's my secret hoard," he whispered. "The others don't know I've got it. And now you and I are going to have one more fling at finding that last ticket. How about it, eh? But you'll have to help me." "Are you sure you want to spend your money on that, Grandpa?" Charlie whispered. "Of course I'm sure," sputtered the old man excitedly. "Don't stand there arguing. I'm as keen as you are to find that ticket. Here, take the money and run down the street to the nearest shop and buy the first Wonka bar you see and bring it straight back to me and we'll open it together." Charlie took the little silver coin and slipped quickly out of the room. In 5 minutes he was back. "Have you got it?" whispered Grandpa Joe, his eyes shining with excitement. Charlie nodded and held out the bar of chocolate. "Wonka's Nutty Crunch Surprise," it said on the wrapper. "Good," the old man whispered, sitting up in the bed and rubbing his hands. "Now, come over here and sit close to me and we'll open it together. Are you ready?" "Yes," Charlie said. "I'm ready." "All right. You tear off the first bit." "No," Charlie said. "You paid for it. You do it all." The old man's fingers were trembling most terribly as they fumbled with the wrapper. "We don't have a hope, really," he whispered, giggling a bit. "You know we don't have a hope, don't you?" "Yes," Charlie said. "I know that." They looked at each other, and both started giggling nervously. "Mind you," said Grandpa Joe. "There is just a tiny chance." "Yes," Charlie said. "Of course. Why don't you open it, Grandpa?" "All in good time, my boy, all in good time. Which end do you think I ought to open first? That corner, the one furthest from you. Just tear off a tiny bit, but not quite enough for us to see anything." "Like that?" said the old man. "Yes. Now a little bit more." "You finish it," said Grandpa Joe. "I'm too nervous." "No, Grandpa, you must do it yourself." "Very well, then. Here goes." He tore off the wrapper. They both stared at what lay underneath. It was a bar of chocolate, nothing more. All at once they both saw the funny side of the whole thing, and they burst into peals of laughter. "What on earth's going on?" cried Grandma Josephine, waking up suddenly. "Nothing," said Grandpa Joe. "You go back to sleep." During the next 2 weeks, the weather turned very cold. First came the snow. It began very suddenly one morning, just as Charlie Bucket was getting dressed for school. Standing by the window, he saw the huge flakes drifting slowly down. By evening, it lay 4 feet deep around the tiny house, and Mr. Bucket had to dig a path from the front door to the road. After the snow, there came a freezing gale that blew for days and days without stopping, and oh, how bitter cold it was. Inside the house, little jets of freezing air came rushing through the sides of the windows and under the doors, and there was no place to go to escape them. The 4 old ones lay silent and huddled in their bed. The excitement over the golden tickets had long since been forgotten. Nobody in the family gave a thought now to anything except the 2 vital problems of trying to keep warm and trying to get enough to eat. There is something about very cold weather that gives one an enormous appetite. Most of us find ourselves beginning to crave rich steaming stews and hot apple pies and all kinds of delicious warming dishes. And because we are all a great deal luckier than we realize, we usually get what we want, or near enough. But Charlie Bucket never got what he wanted, because the family couldn't afford it. Both bars of chocolate, the birthday one and the one Grandpa Joe had bought, had long since been nibbled away, and all he got now were those thin, cabbagey meals 3 times a day. Then all at once, the meals became even thinner. The reason for this was that the toothpaste factory, the place where Mr. Bucket worked, suddenly went bust and had to close down. Quickly, Mr. Bucket tried to get another job, but he had no luck. In the end, the only way in which he managed to earn a few pennies was by shoveling snow in the streets. But it wasn't enough to buy even a quarter of the food that 7 people needed. Breakfast was a single slice of bread for each person now, and lunch was maybe half a boiled potato. Slowly but surely, everybody in the house began to starve. And every day, little Charlie Bucket, trudging through the snow on his way to school, would have to pass Mr. Willy Wonka's giant chocolate factory. And every day as he came near to it, he would lift his small pointed nose high in the air and sniff the wonderful sweet smell of melting chocolate. "That child," said Grandpa Joe, poking his head up from under the blanket one icy morning, "that child has got to have more food. It doesn't matter about us. We're too old to bother with. But a growing boy, he can't go on like this. He's beginning to look like a skeleton." "What can one do?" murmured Grandma Josephine miserably. "He refuses to take any of ours. I heard his mother try to slip her own piece of bread onto his plate at breakfast this morning, but he wouldn't touch it. He made her take it back." "He's a fine little fellow," said Grandpa George. "He deserves better than this." The cruel weather went on, and every day Charlie Bucket grew thinner and thinner. His face became frighteningly white and pinched. His skin was drawn so tightly over the cheeks that you could see the shapes of the bones underneath. It seemed doubtful whether he could go on much longer without becoming dangerously ill. And now, very calmly, with that curious wisdom that seems to come so often to small children in times of hardship, he began to make little changes here and there in some of the things that he did, so as to save his strength. In the mornings, he left the house 10 minutes earlier so that he could walk slowly to school without ever having to run. He sat quiet in the classroom during break, resting himself, while the others rushed outdoors and threw snowballs and wrestled in the snow. Everything he did now, he did slowly and carefully to prevent exhaustion. Then one afternoon, walking back home with the icy wind in his face, his eye was caught suddenly by something silvery lying in the gutter in the snow. Charlie stepped off the curb and bent down to examine it. Part of it was buried under the snow, but he saw at once what it was. It was a 50-pence piece. Quickly he looked around him. Had somebody just dropped it? No, that was impossible because of the way part of it was buried. Several people went hurrying past him on the pavement, their chins sunk deep in the collars of their coats, their feet crunching in the snow. None of them was searching for any money. Then was it his, this 50 pence? Could he have it? Carefully, Charlie pulled it out from under the snow. It was damp and dirty, but otherwise perfect. A whole 50 pence. He held it tightly between his shivering fingers, gazing down at it. It meant one thing to him at that moment, only one thing. It meant food. Automatically, Charlie turned and began moving towards the nearest shop. It was only 10 paces away. It was a newspaper and stationery shop, the kind that sells almost everything, including sweets and cigars. And what he would do, he whispered quickly to himself, he would buy one luscious bar of chocolate and eat it all up, every bit of it, right then and there, and the rest of the money he would take straight back home and give to his mother. Charlie entered the shop and laid the damp 50 pence on the counter. "One Wonka's Whipple Scrumptious Fudge Mallow Delight," he said, remembering how much he had loved the one it had on his birthday. The man behind the counter looked fat and well-fed. He had big lips and fat cheeks and a very fat neck. He turned and reached behind him for the chocolate bar. Then he turned back again and handed it to Charlie. Charlie grabbed it and quickly tore off the wrapper and took an enormous bite. Then he took another and another, and oh, the joy of being able to cram large pieces of something sweet and solid into one's mouth. "You look like you wanted that one, sonny," the shopkeeper said pleasantly. Charlie nodded, his mouth bulging with chocolate. The shopkeeper put Charlie's change on the counter. "Take it easy," he said. "It'll give you a tummy ache if you swallow it like that without chewing." Charlie went on wolfing the chocolate. He couldn't stop. And in less than half a minute, the whole thing had disappeared down his throat. He reached out a hand to take the change. Then he paused. His eyes were just above the level of the counter. They were staring at the silver coins lying there. The coins were all 5-penny pieces. There were 9 of them altogether. Surely it wouldn't matter if he spent just one more. "I think," he said quietly, "I think I'll have just one more of those chocolate bars, the same kind as before, please." "Why not?" the fat shopkeeper said, reaching behind him again and taking another Whipple Scrumptious Fudge Mallow Delight from the shelf. He laid it on the counter. Charlie picked it up and tore off the wrapper, and suddenly, from underneath the wrapper, there came a brilliant flash of gold. Charlie's heart stood still. "It's the golden ticket!" screamed the shopkeeper, leaping about a foot in the air. "You've got a golden ticket! You've found the last golden ticket! Come and look at this, everybody! The kid's found Wonka's last golden ticket! There it is! It's righty in his hands!" It seemed as though the shopkeeper might be going to have a fit. "In my shop, too," he yelled. "He found it right here, in my own little shop. Somebody call the newspapers quick and let them know. Watch out now, sonny. Don't tear it as you unwrap it." In a few seconds, there was a crowd of about 20 people clustering around Charlie, and many more were pushing their way in from the street. Everybody wanted to get a look at the golden ticket and at the lucky finder. "Where is it?" somebody shouted. "Hold it up so all of us can see it." "There it is, there!" someone else shouted. "He's holding it in his hands. See the gold shining." "How did he manage to find it, I'd like to know?" a large boy shouted angrily. 20 bars a day I've been buying for weeks and weeks." "Think of all the free stuff he'll be getting, too," another boy said enviously. "A lifetime supply." "He'll need it, the skinny little shrimp," a girl said, laughing. Charlie hadn't moved. He hadn't even unwrapped the golden ticket from around the chocolate. He was standing very still, holding it tightly with both hands, while the crowd pushed and shouted all around him. He felt quite dizzy. There was a peculiar floating sensation coming over him. His feet didn't seem to be touching the ground at all. He could hear his heart thumping away loudly somewhere in his throat. At that point, he became aware of a hand resting lightly on his shoulder, and when he looked up, he saw a tall man standing over him. "Listen," the man whispered. "I'll buy it from you. I'll give you £50. How about it, eh? And I'll give you a new bicycle as well, okay?" "Are you crazy?" shouted a woman who was standing equally close. "Why, I'd give him £200 for that ticket. You want to sell that ticket for £200, young man?" "That's quite enough of that," the fat shopkeeper shouted. "Leave the kid alone, will you? Make way there, let him out." And to Charlie, as he led him to the door, he whispered, "Don't let anybody have it. Take it straight home quickly before you lose it. Run all the way and don't stop till you get there. You understand?" Charlie nodded. "You know something?" the fat shopkeeper said, pausing a moment and smiling at Charlie. "I have a feeling you needed a break like this. Good luck to you, sonny." "Thank you," Charlie said, and off he went, running through the snow as fast as his legs would go. Charlie burst through the front door shouting, "Mother, mother, mother!" Mrs. Bucket was in the old grandparents' room serving them their evening soup. "Mother!" yelled Charlie, rushing in on them like a hurricane. "Look, I've got it! Look, Mother, look! The last golden ticket! It's mine! I found some money in the street and I bought 2 bars of chocolate and the second one had the golden ticket and there were crowds of people all around me wanting to see it and the shopkeeper rescued me and I ran all the way home and here I am! It's the 5th golden ticket, Mother, and I found it!" Mrs. Bucket simply stood and stared, while the 4 old grandparents, who were sitting up in bed balancing bowls of soup on their laps, all dropped their spoons with a clatter and froze against their pillows. For about 10 seconds there was absolute silence in the room. Nobody dared to speak or move. It was a magic moment. Then very softly, Grandpa Joe said, "You're pulling our legs, Charlie, aren't you? You're having a little joke." "I am not," cried Charlie, rushing up to the bed and holding out the large and beautiful golden ticket for him to see. Grandpa Joe leaned forward and took a close look, his nose almost touching the ticket. The others watched him, waiting for the verdict. And very slowly, with a slow and marvelous grin spreading all over his face, Grandpa Joe lifted his head and looked straight at Charlie. Then the old man took a deep breath, and suddenly, with no warning whatsoever, an explosion seemed to take place inside him. He threw up his arms and yelled, "Yippee!" And at the same time, his long, bony body rose up out of the bed, and his bowl of soup went flying into the face of Grandma Josephine, and in one fantastic leap, this old fellow of 96 and a half, who hadn't been out of bed these last 20 years, jumped onto the floor and started doing a dance of victory in his pajamas. "Yippee!" he shouted. "3 cheers for Charlie! Hip, hip, hooray!" At this point, the door opened and Mr. Bucket walked into the room. He was cold and tired, and he looked it. All day long he'd been shoveling snow in the streets. "Cripes!" he cried. "What's going on in here?" It didn't take them long to tell him what had happened. "I don't believe it," he said. "It's not possible." "Show him the ticket, Charlie!" shouted Grandpa Joe, who was still dancing around the floor like a dervish in his striped pajamas. "Show your father the 5th and last golden ticket in the world." "Let me see it, Charlie," Mr. Bucket said, collapsing into a chair and holding out his hand. Charlie came forward with the precious document. It was a very beautiful thing, this golden ticket, having been made, so it seemed, from a sheet of pure gold, hammered out almost to the thinness of paper. On one side of it, printed by some clever method in jet black letters, was the invitation itself, from Mr. Wonka. "Read it aloud," said Grandpa Joe, climbing back into bed at last. "Let's all hear exactly what it says." Mr. Bucket held the lovely golden ticket up close to his eyes. His hands were trembling slightly. He took several deep breaths. "All right, here we go. Greetings to you, the lucky finder of this golden ticket from Mr. Willy Wonka. I shake you warmly by the hand. Tremendous things are in store for you. Many wonderful surprises await you. For now, I do invite you to come to my factory and be my guest for one whole day. You and all others who are lucky enough to find my golden tickets. I, Willy Wonka, will conduct you around the factory myself, showing you everything there is to see. And afterwards, when it's time to leave, you will be escorted home by a procession of large trucks. These trucks, I can promise you, will be loaded with enough delicious eatables to last you and your entire household for many years. If at any time thereafter you should run out of supplies, you have only to come back to the factory and show this golden ticket, and I shall be happy to refill your cupboard with whatever you want. In this way, you will be able to keep yourself supplied with tasty morsels for the rest of your life. But this is by no means the most exciting thing that will happen on the day of your visit. I am preparing other surprises that are even more marvelous and more fantastic for you and all my beloved golden ticket holders. Mystic and marvelous surprises that will entrance, delight, intrigue, astonish, and perplex you beyond measure. In your wildest dreams you could not imagine that such things could happen to you. Just wait and see. And now, here are your instructions. The day I have chosen for the visit is the first day in the month of February. On this day, and no other, you must come to the factory gates at 10 o'clock sharp in the morning. Don't be late. And you are allowed to bring with you either one or two members of your own family to look after you and to ensure that you don't get into mischief. One more thing. Be certain to have this ticket with you. Otherwise, you will not be admitted. Signed, Willy Wonka. The first day of February, cried Mrs. Bucket, but that's tomorrow. Today is the last day of January. I know it is. Cripes, said Mr. Bucket, I think you're right. You're just in time, shouted Grandpa Joe. There's not a moment to lose. You must start making preparations at once. Wash your face, comb your hair, scrub your hands, blow your nose, cut your nails, get all that mud off your trousers. You must get ready, my boy. You must get ready for the biggest day of your life. Now, don't over-excite yourself, Grandpa, Mrs. Bucket said, and don't fluster poor Charlie. Now, the first thing to decide is this. Who is going to go with Charlie to the factory? I will, shouted Grandpa Joe, leaping out of bed once again. I'll take him, I'll look after him, you leave it to me. Mrs. Bucket smiled at the old man. Then she turned to her husband and said, How about you, dear? Don't you think you ought to go? Well, Mr. Bucket said, No, I'm not sure that I should. But you must. There is no must about it, my dear, Mr. Bucket said gently. Mind you, I'd love to go, but on the other hand, I believe that the person who really deserves to go most of all is Grandpa Joe himself. He seems to know more about it than we do. Yippee! Shouted Grandpa Joe, seizing Charlie by the hands and dancing round the room. Yes, perhaps you're right after all, Mrs. Bucket said, laughing. Perhaps Grandpa Joe should be the one to go with him. Hallelujah! Yelled Grandpa Joe. Praise the Lord! At that point, there came a loud knock on the front door. Mr. Bucket went to open it, and the next moment, swarms of newspaper men and photographers were pouring into the house. For several hours there was complete pandemonium in the little house, and it must have been nearly midnight before Mr. Bucket was able to get rid of them so that Charlie could go to bed.